I want to welcome up our second panelist, Dr. Michael Gaudio. Michael is professor of art history here at the University of Minnesota and also the current department chair. He has a PhD from Stanford in art history, and his research has concentrated on art in the Atlantic world in the early modern period. His first book was Engraving the Savage, The New World and Techniques of Civilization, which was published in 2008. And he also has a new book out this year called The Bible and the Printed Image in Early Modern England, Little Gidding and the Pursuit of Scriptural Harmony. That book, as I understand, forms the basis for the presentation that he's going to give today. And I want to also mention a special thanks to Michael for being here today. Art history is in the midst of a department review today and tomorrow, and so it's very hard to find time. And so we very much appreciate him making time in the midst of that to be here. So let's welcome Michael.
I'd much rather be here than being reviewed.
I got a couple of bonus images at the end of that.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and thank you for the invitation to do this. And thanks, Jennifer, for just a really fascinating paper that I think is going to link up in some interesting ways with what I have to say here. So just go.
There you go. Get a little greedy.
Okay, so I'm going to basically just try to introduce some books to you, perhaps suggest a couple ways of thinking about them, but the main thing is to just get them on the screen and give them a little bit of context. These aren't the books that are my main concern, but these are part of the context for them. And the context for these Bibles that I'll be showing is religious politics in England in the 1630s and the 1640s. This is in a panel about Bible illustration. It's biblical images. It's kind of a strange period to be looking at because this was not a moment conducive to Bible illustration. The eminent historian Patrick Collinson has written that nothing, trying to think through the impact of Puritanism on biblical imagery in early modern England. He writes that nothing demonstrates more forcefully the absolute refusal of so many late Elizabethan and Jacobean religious communicators to appeal to the senses and to popular taste than the pictures which are missing from their books. That's not really a fair statement, and I'm going to show you one really interesting example of why I think that's not the case. But there is some legitimacy to that claim that Puritan influence narrowed the possibility for book illustration at this time, especially of Bibles. So, for example, in the late 1630s, after King Charles and Archbishop William Laud had made their disastrous trip to Scotland in 1637 to impose the English liturgy on Scotland, Scottish Covenanters, Scottish Presbyterians, and enemies of the king charged the king with authorizing the printing of Bibles in Edinburgh that were illustrated, and this is what they said, illustrated with such abominable pictures that horrible impiety stares through them. So presumably what was printed and put out something like what you have here. This is a authorized version of the Bible, a King James version of the Bible from this period with plates, engraved plates that have come from Catholic Antwerp, put into bound in with the book. So this was a serious enough charge that the king felt that he had to respond to it. And this is what he does in a large declaration concerning the late tumults in Scotland. And in that book, the king claims, or the king's ghostwriter claims that he didn't do it. He doesn't claim no. He doesn't say, oh, images are fine, and yes, indeed, I did put them in there. He says, no, I didn't do it. He says some papists had caused these several pieces to be bound into their Bibles. This is the politics, the religious politics of the moment are that you cannot claim to have done this. Or in similar terms, take the example of William Laud himself. So Laud is arrested, put on trial in 1644. The trial record is on the right here, aptly named Canterbury's Doom. And explains on the title page here the charges that were laid against Laud. He was charged with traitorous endeavors to alter and subvert God's true religion by law. Can't quite make blah, blah, blah. Abolished, to introduce and set up popish superstition and idolatry in place of the proper law. And one of among the specific charges waged against Laud was the charge that he kept Bible illustrations in his private quarters at Lambeth Palace. And specifically the set of Bible illustrations whose frontispiece that you see on the left side of the screen by the Flemish artist Boetius Bosworth. And so, like the king, Laud's response was not to take responsibility for these. And for those of you who can think back to the Clinton administration in an early version of the "I smoked but did not inhale" defense, Laud says, I kept the book only as a scholar, to peruse and refute it upon occasion, not to adore or make use of the pictures in it. So I use these examples to make the point that Bible illustration was a highly politicized, controversial practice at this moment, easily equated with popery. And though despite the protests against the charges that were laid against them, the king and Archbishop Laud did indeed commission Bible illustrations and collected them. The two books on the screen, for example, were both made for them. The one on the right for the king in 1635 and the one on the left for Archbishop Laud in 1640. These books are my concern. These two on the screen and the 13 others that were made by the same family at the estate of Little Gidding outside of Cambridge, in Cambridgeshire in England. And so it's these Bibles that I want to introduce to you here. And to do that, I need to introduce the family a little bit. So the family at Little Gidding was under the patriarch of this family, though he himself was a bachelor, was Nicholas Ferrar, whose portrait you see right there. Nicholas Ferrar was a very prominent figure in the city of London. He was a member of the Virginia Company, Minister of Parliament, and in 1624 the Virginia Company failed, and Ferrar saw that as really an opportunity for him to bring his extended family to rural Cambridgeshire, what was then called Huntingdonshire, and try to live out an ideal life of Protestant piety and devotion. And so this is what he did, and they very kind of strictly regulated their days according to the daily offices in the Book of Common Prayer, and also according to different devotional labors. And one of the key devotional labors that occurred at Little Gidding was the making of what they called concordances. And these were made by the women in the family. Nicholas's sister, Susanna Collett, had 8 daughters. Collett. And so when I refer to the Collett sisters, these are the women that I'm talking about. The eldest of them were Mary and Anna Collett, and they had the biggest hand in the making of these concordances. But these women spent an hour each day in what they called the concordance chamber, working on these volumes. Here's 4 of them on the screen. Most of them take the form of Gospel Harmonies, showing how the 4 Gospels harmonize with each other. That's important, right? That there's one story behind all. Despite the variety of Gospels, there's one story behind them all. Some of them also, there are Pentateuch harmonies as well. There are also individual books of the Bible simply constructed in this particular manner that I will describe in a minute here. Another thing to say about them is that there's about 15 of them that survive. They're quite large. They vary in size, but they're all quite large. The one on the bottom right here, for example, is a harmony of the Pentateuch. This is at Windsor Castle, and it's massive and requires 2 people to carry it. It's about 30 inches in one dimension, about 20 inches in another, and composed of 450 pages of very heavy paper. This volume right here is at an estate in Southampton, owned by a private owner. It is not quite as large as that, but nearly as large. I actually, when I went to see, one of the times I went to see this, I had to read it at the estate office, but the book was located at the estate house, and they really shouldn't have done this, but they just told me to carry it out to my car and take it over to the estate office. So I've trudged with this book out to my old rented Renault in Southampton. It was heavy. These are, I mean, the point being that these are big books. They're meant to be stood over, turned pages with a kind of hand and a shoulder rather than flipping them with your fingers. This is the Word made flesh in these books, and I really think a kind of incarnational understanding of is appropriate to understanding the physicality, materiality of these objects. Here's a couple pages from the one in the Southampton volume that I just mentioned to you. This was made in 1640 for the Prince of Wales, Charles, the Prince of Wales, who became, of course, Charles II ultimately. Now, the purpose of a gospel harmony, and that's what this volume is. This is a gospel harmony. It's to show how the gospels harmonize with one another. And it's a form, of course, that has a very long history, though it did experience a renewed popularity beginning in the 16th century. So as Bibles were being disseminated rapidly through print, this burgeoning print culture in the 16th century and reaching ever more diverse interpretive communities, and therefore ever more diverse interpretations, there was a very strongly felt need to demonstrate the essential concord of biblical doctrine, hence a new relevance to the gospel harmony. So Gospel Harmonies were published in a variety of forms. Some of them were even illustrated, but no printed Gospel Harmony was made quite in like these were made here. They were made by cutting up the text of printed Bibles and then stringing that text together into a continuous narrative to show how it harmonizes. But even more curiously, this same logic is used for the illustrations in the book. So you have hundreds of engravings and etchings appearing throughout these albums, but none of them were printed specifically for these books, right? All of these were previously published prints, most of them Catholic devotional prints published in Antwerp in the late 16th, early 17th centuries. And we could talk, of course, more about how we should understand Protestants making use of Catholic images in this way, because that's one of the real interesting questions around these books. But for now, I just simply want to address the mechanics of how prints are employed here and give you a sense of how they work. Often the prints were trimmed around the border and then simply pasted onto the page. That's what occurs here, more or less, in just this very large form, where you have a massive print of the raising of the story of the brazen serpent being pasted across 2 pages of the album. Essentially no alterations really being made to that particular print. But actually more frequently, these prints were cut into smaller fragments that could be then used selectively and arranged into entirely new compositions. So to take you through a little bit of this, take this page. This is from a different harmony. This one is located in Hatfield House, just north of London. In the text, on the lower portion of the page here, cut from the first chapter of Matthew, we read about the angel who appears to Joseph in a dream and tells him not to fear to take Mary as his wife because she's conceived by the Holy Ghost. And so at the top of the page, there's an image to help us reflect on this story. Just to show you that a little more closely. It appears at first glance to be a horizontally oriented biblical print in which the angel appears to the sleeping Joseph outside the door to Mary's private chamber, where she sits alone at her devotions. But in fact, this picture is a collage assembled, by my count, from 10 different pieces. And so what I'll do is just indicate the particular pieces with a red outline to show you how it's put together. So the figure of the Virgin, as you can see here, is clipped from the Annunciation scene of Martin de Vos's Vita Passio et Resurrectio Jesu Christi, a series of these Flemish prints published in Antwerp, and this one published around 1600. Let's see where that comes from. The figure of the angel appearing to Joseph, though, in its original context, is an entirely unrelated subject to what we see here. It's taken from a print in the collection, a collection of Old and New Testament prints published in Antwerp again in 1585 in this case. And the subject of this print is the moment in the apocryphal book of 2 Esdras in which Esdras, whose vision has caused him to collapse in fear here, is visited by the angel Uriel, who comforts him. And so it enters into a new context when it's put into the Little Gidding album. David, this must be yours.
That would be mine, yes. I'm sorry about that. I didn't do this, but.
Yeah, sorry, we've compiled the presentation, maybe.
Yeah, I'm missing a bunch of images. Maybe the easiest thing to do is see if they got me to switch over to here, which I can do really quick. Sorry about that, Nancy. Just have to take off this. Please show up. There we go. So that's where we just were. Okay, so we saw those being taken, and then an open door you see here, right through the center of the image. An open door has been cut out from another print. I don't know the particular source of this open door, and pasted right through the center of the image that the College Sisters made, separating the outside space where Joseph has his dream from Mary's interior space. And this is really an important threshold, right? It marks Mary's distance from Joseph prior to the dream, when Joseph is minded to put her away privily, and then at the same time, as an open door inviting passage, it anticipates the transformation within Joseph after awaking from his dream when he takes unto him his wife. And then a number of small pieces fill out the background here, giving the picture its rectangular format. 2 pieces are placed just below Mary, so it appears as if she's sitting at the top of some steps. There's one, there's another. Surrounding Joseph and the angel are architectural facades indicating that this is an exterior space that they're located in. And finally, there are some various small pieces that fill out the print, including a caption placed in the lower left. So you can see the kind of thinking that has gone here. It's a very thoughtful interpretation of Scripture in the choices that are being made in the construction of this collage. I want, just in the interest of time, I want to show you this. This is a very interesting image and showing Judas's suicide and his bowels gushing out, and some very interesting choices made here, but I will just skip over that. Now, the first of these were made for use at Little Gidding, for the use of the family, the Farrar Collett family. But increasingly, they became known. The king heard about them. The poet George Herbert heard about them. He was a good friend of the family. And they started to be given away as gifts and sought after as gifts. The page on the left is from a concordance made for the king, one of several that were done for him. It was delivered to the Archbishop of Canterbury in 1635, who in turn presented it to King Charles. Charles was extremely pleased. He praised the workmanship of the sisters and said, would I had something like, would I had many more such virgins in my kingdom who could produce such handiworks. There even seems to be a certain amount of self-consciousness among these women. It's interesting that we have something like a self-portrait of the Collett sisters in one of their works. They place these figures on the right-hand side of the screen, which is a detail of the full page on the left-hand side. This is from their Acts of the Apostles. So this is actually not a harmony. This is simply the Acts of the Apostles that's constructed in a large album by cutting out the text from the King James Version and then finding images to collage around it. So the figures include here what appears at top to be an image of the Virgin, who was a figure that had a special significance for her namesake, Mary Collett, who was herself pledged to virginity. On the left is another figure of a woman right here. This is probably, I don't know the specific source for this, but it was probably from the life of St. Teresa, I'm guessing, but a figure writing at her desk. The same or a similar figure appears in her devotions at the bottom, hands clasped in prayer. And then finally, on the right, a woman absorbed in her sewing. The Collett sisters were also known for their needlework, by the way. And you can see her scissors sticking out there from her sewing basket at her feet. In the midst of these women runs the text from Acts 21:9. It's cut out from the Bible, pasted onto the page just like the cutout prints. And the same man had 4 daughters, virgins, which did prophesy. So these 4 cutout figures were chosen by the Collett sisters to represent the 4 devout daughters of Philip. And it's a minor verse, right? And not a passage that's typically chosen for illustration. It virtually has no iconography in European art history. But the Colletts considered this passage important enough to invent their own iconography for it, and this is because it's very significant when we read it in light of Mary and Anna Collett and their role in the religious community at Little Gidding. This was a community widely known for the devoutness of its female members, especially Mary and Anna, the maiden sisters as they were called, who, like Philip's daughters, were devoted to the task of making their house a holy one. So in cutting and pasting these female figures into their homemade version of Acts of the Apostles, Mary and Anna, I think, were essentially engaging in an act of self-portrayal. And those scissors in the sewing basket of the woman on the right, I think, really call our attention to the instruments of the Collett's own form of prophecy. The scissors, not only with which they did their needlework, but with which they cut out images and texts in order to construct these books intended for devotional use. Now, Little Gidding was never in the public eye in the way that the Archbishop and his idolatry was at his trial, for example, or the way the king was after his visit to Scotland. But it wasn't entirely out of the public eye either. Despite its isolation, the community was actually known throughout England, and it too became the target of Puritan attacks against Laudian Protestants. Most notoriously in the 1641 pamphlet entitled The Arminian Nunnery, or a brief description and relation of the late erected monastical place called the Arminian Nunnery at Little Gidding in Huntingdonshire. So Arminian, a word used by Puritans to refer to Arminius, the Dutch theologian, and to indicate Catholic tendencies. The title here pretty well sums up the content of this 10-page document that exposes Little Gidding as a bridge to popery, in the words of the author. And the author talks about how it's amazing that the Archbishop would ever allow the kind of things that go on at Little Gidding, such as the richly decked altar in Little Gidding's chapel, the candles and silver chalices and candlesticks in the chapel, as well as a baptismal font with carved images on it. These things are horrible to say that these are present at Little Gidding. There's no mention of the Bible concordances in the Arminian Nunnery, which suggests that the author probably had no knowledge about them, but he does single out the women who made these books as being particularly popish in their tendencies. And the title of the pamphlet, after all, refers to Nicholas Ferrar's nieces, Mary and Anna Collett, as these nuns at Gidding. And this idea of Little Gidding as a nunnery that is given over to a sensual and feminine Catholicism is given visual form here on the title page, where a woman who's dressed in nun's habit stands in front of the chapel at Little Gidding, holding in her right hand a Bible, and then holding in her other hand, kind of creeping subtly there from behind her gown, holding evidence of her idolatrous nature, a rosary. So the question then to think about is how we understand the legitimacy of these works. Are these just crypto-Catholics at Little Gidding, as their Puritan accusers would have it? Or can we identify a more specifically Protestant approach to Bible illustration here? So I just want to end then with a possible answer to this question, to get us thinking about them. And these, by the way, are the final pages of an apocalypse that was made at Little Gidding. So again, this one, not a harmony either, but simply a very richly illustrated book of Revelation. And it's really difficult for me to convey through these digital images that I'm showing you the experience of leafing through one of these biblical scrapbooks. That experience involves two kinds of awareness that really occur simultaneously. One is your sense that all of this is remarkably integrated, right? These pages, almost as if you are looking at a printed page. And this is certainly a desired effect. You get a very powerful sense looking at these of the uniformity of the page. The words and images meticulously cut out, laid on the page, and then placed by the collets under a heavy iron press used by bookbinders to assure a good bond and the flatness of the page. So that, and Nicholas Farrar's brother, John Farrar, wrote a biography of this brother, and he described these books. And he says in that biography, all that saw the books when they were done took them to be printed the ordinary way. The idea is that you mistake them for works printed on the press. But these books are not really meant to be treasured for their aesthetic perfection, for a perfect harmony achieved, as you know, from a Puritan point of view, no doubt, as idols that might lead us away from the proper devotional work that religion requires. So the other kind of awareness that you have with these concordances is the knowledge that I've just described. The sense of that sense of a perfectly harmonious text is exactly not what you're looking at. That what you see is not the uniform work of mechanical reproduction, but the work of scissors and knives. It's a text constructed out of fragments. You might be fooled at first glance looking at these books, but on closer perusal, you run your fingers over the page, you look more closely, and you find that this is indeed a book composed of fragments, placed together, carefully taken apart, deconstructed, to come back to Jennifer's point about the relationship between construction and destruction. And this almost being taken in is just the point. This, what you end with is not the perfection of the object itself, but awareness of the marvelous labor of its creators that has gone into creating them. So the making of these albums then demonstrates, I think, a complex thinking about the visual image, a thinking that's somewhere in between what Puritans critiqued as a popish attachment to the visual image itself, and on the other hand, a need to show the labor that's gone into the work of making these albums, in a sense, destructive labor in some senses. And as just a very final note on that destructiveness that goes into these albums, which is, of course, inseparable from the creative constructiveness of these books, there is indeed an iconoclastic impulse that runs through the Little Gidding albums, for example, in their habitual replacement of images of God the Father with the Tetragrammaton, or with Latin text. So on the right-hand side, you see the title page, a portion of the title page to the Little Gidding Apocalypse, and you can see a whole bunch of images that have been pasted onto the page, but wherever God the Father appeared in these Flemish prints, he's been removed and a tetragram has been placed, or in this case, just Deus Pater. See another one right here, always obscuring where the image of God the Father was. Or here, this is interesting because it's we do have some of the surviving print stock, the images that were used at Little Gidding that were never pasted into a volume, and in some cases where the image had God the Father, we find God the Father having been cut out and have this very interesting image with an absent God. So they were, in a sense, iconoclast at Little Gidding, but at the same time they were not. And I think if we don't allow that paradox to stand, then we've missed something really important about how an English Protestant household could engage productively with religious images in their Bibles in the 17th century. Thanks very much.